Chapter 15. Renomswood crouched wordlessly with her companions in the darkness of the tunnels beneath the keel, while the owl worked in silence somewhere ahead, striking flint against stone to produce a spark that would ignite the pitch-coated torch he balanced on his knees. The magic that had illuminated the tunnel when Ren had come into the city was gone now, disappeared with Arbelon and the elves into the Loden. Tris had been the last to enter, carrying Ellen Rowe from the bridge, and he had closed the door tightly behind, shutting them away from the madness that raged without, but trapping them as well with the heat and the stench of Kelishan's fire. A spark caught in the darkness ahead, and a dark orange flame flared to life, casting shadows everywhere. Heads turned to where the owl was already starting away. "Be quick," he whispered back to them, his voice rough and urgent. "It won't take long for the dark things to find that door." They crept swiftly after him, Eowyn, Dal, Gavilan, Ren, Garth, Tris carrying Ellen Rowe, and Court trailing. Beyond, burrowing down into the earth with the tenacity of moles, the howls and shrieks of the demons tracked them. Sweat beaded on Ren's skin, the heat of the tunnels intense and stifling. She brushed at her eyes, blinked away the stinging moisture, and worked to keep pace. Her thoughts strayed as she laboured, and she remembered Ellen Rowe standing at the centre of the bridgehead, invoking the Loden, calling forth the light that would sweep up all of Arbelon and carry it down into the gleaming depths of the stone. She could see the city disappear, vanishing as if it never were. Buildings, people, animals, trees, grass, everything. Now Arbelon was their responsibility, theirs to protect, cradled within a magic that was only as strong as the 9 men and women to whom it had been entrusted. She pushed past trailing roots and spiders' webs, and the enormity of the task settled on her like a weight. She was only one, she knew, and not the strongest. Yet she could not escape the feeling that the responsibility was inevitably hers alone, an extension of Elenon's charge, the reason for which she had come in search of the elves. She shook the feeling aside, crowding up against Gavilan in her haste to keep moving. Then abruptly, the earth shuddered. The line stopped, and heads lowered protectively as silk broke free of the tunnel roof in a shower. The ground shook again. The tremors, building steadily, rocking the earth as if some giant had seized the island in both hands and was struggling to lift it free. "What's happening?" Ren heard Gavilan demand. She dropped to her knees to keep from being thrown off balance, feeling Garth's steadying hand settle on her shoulder. "Keep moving," the owl snapped. "Hurry." They ran now, crouched low against a pall of dirt that hung rolling in the air. The tremors continued, a rumbling from beneath, the sound rising and falling, a quaking that tossed them against the tunnel walls and left them struggling to remain upright. The seconds sped away, fleeing as quickly as they did. It seemed, from the horror following, a part of the tunnel collapsed behind them, showering them with dirt. They could hear a cracking of stone, a splitting apart of the lava rock, as if the earth's crust were giving way. There was a heavy thud as a great boulder dropped through a crevice and struck the tunnel floor. "Ow, get us out of here!" Gavilan called out frantically. Then they were climbing free again, scrambling from the tunnel through an opening in the earth, clawing their way into the weak morning light. Behind them the tunnel collapsed completely, falling away in a rush of air, silt exploding through the opening as they fled. The tremors continued to roll across Morrowind's heights, ripping its surface, causing the rock to grate and crumble. Wren hauled herself to her feet with the others and stood in the shelter of a copse of dying acacia, looking back at where they had been. The keel was swarming with demons, their black bodies everywhere as they sought to scale the hated barrier. The magic was gone, but the tremors that had replaced it proved an even more formidable obstacle. Demons flew from the heights screaming as they fell, shaken free like leaves from an autumn tree in a windstorm. The keel cracked and split as the mountainside shuddered beneath it, chunks of stone tumbling away, the whole of it threatening to collapse. Fire spurted out of the earth from within. The crater from which Avalon had been scooped by the magic became a cauldron of heat and flames. Steam hissed and spurted in geysers. High on Kilishan's slopes, the crust of the mountain skin had ruptured and begun to leak molten rock. Kilishan comes awake, Eowyn said softly, causing them all to turn. The disappearance of Avalon shifted the balance of things on Morrowind. A void was created in the magic. The disruption reaches all the way to the core of the island. The volcano is no longer dormant, no longer stable. The fires within will burn more fiercely, and the gases and heat will build until they can no longer be contained. How long? The owl snapped. Eowyn shook her head. Hours here on the high slopes, days farther down. Her eyes were bright. It is the beginning of the end. There was an instant of uncertain silence. For the demons, perhaps, but not for us. It was Ellen Royal Essedell who spoke, back on her feet again, recovered from the strain of invoking the Loden's magic. She freed herself from Triss's steadying grip and walked through them, drawing them in after her in her wake until she turned to face them. She looked calm and assured and unafraid. No hesitation now, she admonished. We go quickly, quietly, down to the shores of the Blue Divide and off the island, back to where we belong. Keep together. Keep your eyes sharp, Owl. Take us out. Oren Striad turned away at once, and the others went with him. There were no questions asked. Ellen Royal Essedell's presence was that strong. Wren glanced back once to see her grandmother come up beside Eowyn, who seemed to have lapsed into a trance, put her arms about the seer and led her gently away. Behind them, the glare of the volcano's fire turned the keel and the demons, the colour of blood. It seemed as if everything had disappeared in a wash of red. Shadows against the hazy light. The company crept down off the slopes of Kilishan through the rugged mix of lava rock, deadwood and shrub. All of the sounds were behind them now, where the demons converged on an enemy that they were just beginning to discover was no longer there. Ahead, there was only the steady rush of the Rowan as its grey waters churned toward the sea. The tremors chased after, shudders that rippled along the stretches of lava rock and shook the trees and brush. But their impact diminished the farther the company went. Fog clouded the air before them, turning the brightness of early morning haze in the shape of the land indistinct. Wren's breathing steadied, and her body cooled. She no longer felt trapped as she had in the tunnel, and the intensity of the heat had lessened. She began to relax, to feel herself merge with the land, her senses reaching out like an invisible feelers to search out what was hidden. Even so, she failed to detect the demons that lay in wait for them before the attack. There were more than a dozen, smallish and gnarled, crooked like deadwood, rising up with a rendering of brush and sticks to seize at them. Eowyn went down, and the owl disappeared in a flurry of limbs. The others rallied, striking out at their attackers with whatever came to hand. Bunching together about Eowyn protectively, the elven hunters fought with grim ferocity, dispatching the demons as if they were nothing more than shadows. The fight was almost over before it began. One of the black things escaped. The rest lay still upon the ground. The owl reappeared from behind a ridge, one sleeve shredded, his thin face clawed. He beckoned them wordlessly, turning away from the path they had been following, taking them swiftly down from the summit of a rise to a narrow gully that wound ahead into the fog. They watched closely now, alert for further attacks, reminded that the demons would be everywhere, that not all of them would have gone to the kill. The sky overhead turned a peculiar yellow as the sun ascended the sky, yet struggled unsuccessfully to penetrate the fog. Wren crept ahead with long knives in both hands, her eyes sweeping the shadows cautiously for any sign of movement. They were nearing the Rowan when Oren Striat brought them to a sudden halt. He dropped into a crouch, motioning them down with him, then turned, gestured for them to remain where they were, and disappeared ahead into the haze. He was gone for less than 5 minutes before reappearing. He shook his head in warning and motioned them left. Keeping low, they slipped along a line of rocks to where a ridge had hid them from the Rowan. From there, they worked their way parallel to the river for more than a mile, then resurfaced cautiously atop a rise. Wren peered out at the sluggish grey surface of the river, empty and broad before her as it stretched away into the distance. Nothing moved. The owl rejoined them, his leathery face furrowed. The shadows are filled with things we don't want anything to do with. We'll cross here instead. It's too broad and too wide to swim. We'll have to ferry over. We'll build a raft big enough to hold on to. That we'll have to do. He took the elven hunters with him to gather wood, leaving Gavilan and Garth with the woman. Alan Rowe came over to Wren and gave her a brief hug and a reassuring smile. All was well, she was saying. But there were worry lines etched in her brow. She moved quietly away. Feel the earth with your hands, Wren, Eowyn whispered suddenly, crouching next to her. Wren reached down and let the tremors rise into her body. The magic comes apart all about us. Everything the elves sought to build. The fabric of our arrogance and our fear begins to unravel. The rust-coloured hair tumbled wildly about the distant green eyes, and Eowyn had the look of someone awakening from a nightmare. She will have to tell you sometime, Wren. She will have to let you know. Then she was gone as well, moving over to join the Queen. Wren was not sure exactly what she had been talking about, but assured she was referring to Elnro, and that, as the Rover girl already knew, there were secrets still unrevealed. The Vogue swirled about, screening off the Rowan, snaking through the cracks and crevices of the land, changing the shape of everything as it passed. Gordon Dahl returned hauling lengths of deadwood, then disappeared again. The owl passed through the gloom, heading toward the river, stick thin and bent as if it were at hunt. Everything moved as if not quite there, a shading of some half-forgotten memory that could trick you into believing things that never were. A sudden convulsion rocked the earth underfoot, causing Wren to grasp in spite of herself and to reach down hurriedly to regain her balance. The waters of the Rowan seemed to surge sharply, gathering force in a wave that crashed against the shoreline and rolled on into the distance. Garth touched her shoulder. The island shakes itself apart. She nodded, thinking back to Eowyn's declaration that the impending cataclysm was the result of a disruption in the magic. She had thought the seer was referring solely to Ellenroe's use of the Loden, but now it occurred to her that the seer meant something more. The implication of what she had just told Wren was that the disruption of the magic was broader than simply the taking away of Babylon. That at some time in the past the elves had sought to do something more and failed, and that what was happening now was a direct result. She stored the information away carefully for a time when she could make use of it. Garth moved down to help the elven hunters, who were beginning to lash together the logs for the raft. Gavilan was speaking in low tones with Ellenroe, and there was a restless anger reflected in his eyes. Wren watched him carefully for a moment, measuring what she was now against what she had seen before. The hard-edged tension and the careless disregard, two images in sharp contrast. She found Gavilan intriguing, a complex of mixed possibilities and enticements. She liked him. She wanted him close. But there was something hidden in him that bothered her, something she had yet to define. Just a few more minutes, the owl advised, passing by her like a shadow and fading back into the mist. She started to climb to her feet, and something small and quick darted from the undergrowth and threw itself on her. She tumbled back, flailing desperately, then realized in shock that the thing clinging to her was Fawn. She laughed in spite of herself and hugged the tree squeak close. Fawn, she cooed, nuzzling the odd little creature. I thought something terrible had happened to you, but you're all right, aren't you? Yes, little one, you're just fine. She was aware of Ellenroe and Gavilan looking over. Puzzlement registered on their faces, and she quickly climbed to her feet again, waving to them reassuringly, smiling in spite of herself. Have you forgotten your promise? She turned abruptly to find Stresser staring up at her from the edge of the gloom, quills all on end. She knelt hurriedly. So you are all right as well, Mr. Splinterscat. I was worried for both of you. I couldn't come out to see if you were safe, but I hoped you were. Did you find each other after I left? Yes, Wren of the Elves, the Splinterscat replied, his words cool and measured. Fur. The squeak came scampering back at dawn, fur all wild and ragged, chittering about you. It found me down by the river where I was waiting, so now your promise. You remember your promise, don't you? Wren nodded solemnly. I remember, Stresser. When I left the city, I was to take you with me to the Westland. I will keep that promise. Did you worry I would not? The Splinterscat flattened its quills. I hope you were someone whose word meant something, not like... He cut himself short. Grandmother, Wren called out to the Queen, and Ellenroe moved over to join her, curly hair blowing across her face like a veil. Grandmother, These are my friends, Stresser and Fawn. They helped Garth and me find our way to the city." "Then they are my friends as well," Ellen Rowe declared. "Lady," Stresser replied stiffly, not altogether charmed, it seemed. "What's this?" Gavilan came up next to them, amusement dancing in his eyes. "A scat? I thought they were all gone." "There were a few of us. No thanks to you," Stresser announced coldly. "Bold fellow, aren't you?" Gavilan couldn't quite conceal his disapproval. "Grandmother," Wren said quickly, putting an end to the exchange. "I promised Stresser I would take him with us when we left the island. I must keep that promise, and Fawn must come as well." She hugged the furry tree squeak. She hadn't even looked up yet from her shoulder, still burrowed down against her, clinging like a second skin. Ellen Rowe looked doubtful, as if taking the creatures along presented some difficulty that Wren did not understand. "I don't know," she answered quietly. The wind whistled past her, gathering force in the gloom. She gazed off at the elven hunters, at work now unloading backpacks and supplies onto the raft, then said, "But if you gave your promise?" "Aunt tell," Gavilan snapped angrily. The Queen's gaze was icy as it fixed on him. "Keep silent, Gavilan." "But you know the rules." "Keep silent." The anger in Gavilan's face was palpable. He avoided looking at either of her or Wren, shifting his gaze instead to Stresser. "This is a mistake. You should know best, Scat. Remember who made you, and remember why." "Gavilan." The Queen was livid. The elven hunters stood up abruptly from their work and looked back at her. The owl reappeared from out of the mist. Eowyn moved to stand next to the Queen. Gavilan held his ground a moment longer, then wheeled away and stalked down to the raft. For a moment no one else moved, statues in the mist. Then Ellen Rowe said, to no one in particular, her voice sounding small and lost, "I'm sorry." She walked off as well, sweeping Eowyn up in her wake, her youthful features so stricken that it kept Wren from following after. She looked instead at Stresser. The splinter scat's laugh was bitter. "She doesn't want us off the island. None of them do." "Stresser, what is going on here?" Wren demanded, angry herself now, bewildered at the animosity Stresser's appearance had generated. "Wren Onsford, don't you know?" "You don't, do you? Ellen Rowe Elizadel is your grandmother, and you don't know? How strange." "Come, Wren," the owl said, passing by once more, touching her lightly on the shoulder. "Time to be going. Quick now." The elven hunters were shoving the raft down to the water's edge, and the others were hastening after. "Tell me," she snapped at Stresser. "Write down. The Rowan is not my idea of a good time," the splinter cat said, ignoring her. "I'll sit directly in the middle if you please. Or if you don't, for that matter." A renewed series of shudders shook the island, and in the haze behind them, Killer Shan erupted in a shower of crimson fire. Ash and smoke belched out, and a rumbling rose from deep within the earth. They were all calling for Wren now, and she ran to them. Stresser a step ahead, Fawn draped about her neck. She was furious that no one would confide in her, that arguments could be held in her presence about things of which she was being kept deliberately ignorant. She hated being treated this way, and it was becoming apparent that unless she forced the issue, no one was ever going to tell her anything about the elves and Morrowind. She reached the raft as they were pushing it out into the Rowan, meeting Gavilan's openly hostile gaze with one of her own, shifting deliberately closer to guard. The elven hunters were already in water up to their knees, steadying the raft. Stresser hopped aboard without being asked and settled down squarely in the middle of the backpacks and supplies, just as he had threatened he would do. No one objected. No one said anything. Eowyn and the Queen were guided to their places by Triss, the Queen clutching the rook staff tightly in both hands. Ren and Garth followed. Together the members of the little company eased their raft away from the shoreline, leaning forward so that its logs could bear the weight of their upper bodies, their hands grasping the rope ties that had been fashioned to give them a grip. Almost immediately the current caught them up, began to sweep them away. Those closest to the shore kicked in an effort to move clear of the banks, away from the rocks and tree roots that may snag them. Kilishan continued to erupt, fire and ash spewing forth, the volcano rumbling its discontent. The skies darkened with this new layer of fog, clouding farther against the light. The raft moved out into the centre of the channel, rocking with the motion of the water, picking up speed. The owl shouted instructions to his companions, and they tried in vain to manoeuvre the raft toward the far bank. Geysers burst through the lava rock on the shoreline behind them, rupturing the stone skin of the high country, sending steam and gas thrusting skyward. The Rowan shuddered with the force of the earth's rumbling and began to buck. The waters turned choppy and small whirlpools began to form. Debris swirled past, carried on the crest of the river. The raft was buffeted and tossed, and those clinging to it were forced to expend all of their efforts just to hang on. "Tuck in your legs," the owl shouted in warning. "Tighten your grip." Downriver they swept, the shoreline passing in a blur of jagged trees and shrub, ragged lava fields, and mist and haze. The volcano disappeared behind them, screened away by a bend in the river, the beginnings of the valley into which it poured. Ren felt things jab and poke at her, slam up against her, and spin away, and whip past as if yanked by an invisible rope. Her hands and fingers began to ache with the strain of holding on to the rope stays, and her body was chilled numb by the icy mountain waters. The river's rush drowned out the roar of the volcano, but she could still feel it shudder beneath her, waking up, recoiling with sickness and splitting apart with convulsions. Cliffs appeared in front of them, rising like impassable walls. Then they were in their midst. The rock, miraculously, divided to let the Rowan tumble through a narrow file. For a few minutes, the rapids were so severe that it seemed they must break apart on the rocks. Then they were clear again, the channel broadening out once more, the cliffs receding into the distance. They spun through a series of wide, sluggish rifts and emerged in a lake that stretched away into the green haze of a jungle. The river slowed and quieted. The raft quit spinning and began to float lazily toward the centre of the lake. Mist hung thick upon its gleaming surface, screening the shoreline to either side, transforming it into a deep green mask of silence. From somewhere distant, Kilishan's angry rumble sounded. At the centre of the raft, Stresser lifted his head tentatively and looked about. The splinter scat's sharp eyes shifted quickly to find Ren. "We must get away from here," he urged. "This is not good. It is not a good place to be. Over there is Eden's murk." What are you muttering about, scat? Gavilan growled irritably. Ellen Rose shifted her grip on the rook staff where it lay across the raft. Ow! Do you know where we are? Orin Striat shook his head. But if the splinter scat says it is unsafe. The waters behind him erupted thunderously, and a huge, crusted black head reared into view. It rose into the brume, slowly, almost ingloriously, balanced atop a thick, sinuous body of scales and bumps that rippled and flexed against the half-light tendrils trailed from its jaws like feelers twisting to find food. Teeth bared as its greenish mouth widened, crooked and double row. It coiled until it towered over them, no more than 50 feet away, and then it hissed like a snake that has been stepped upon. A serpent! Eowyn cried softly. The elven hunters were already moving, hastily changing position, so that they were bunched between the monster and their charges. Weapons drawn, they began to scull the raft toward the opposite shore. It was a futile attempt. The serpent swam soundlessly in pursuit, expending almost no effort to overtake them, dipping its head threateningly, jaws agape. Wren worked next to Garth to help push the raft ahead, but the riverbank seemed a long way off. At the centre of the raft, Stress's spikes stuck out in all directions, and his head disappeared. The serpent hit them with its tail when they were still 100 yards from shore, swinging it up into them from underneath, lifting the raft and the 9 who clung to it clear of the water, spinning them into the air. They flew for a short distance and landed with a whomp that knocked the breath from their bodies. Grips loosened and people and packs tumbled away. Eowyn splashed frantically, went under, and was pulled back to the surface by Garth. The raft had begun to come apart from the force of the landing. Ties loosening, logs splitting. The owl yelled at them to kick, and they did, frantically, furiously, for there was nothing else they could do. The serpent came at them again, sliding out of the Rowan with a huffing that sprayed water everywhere. Its cry was a deep, booming cough as it launched itself, body flexing and coiling, huge and monstrous as it descended. Wren and Garth broke free of the raft as the beast struck, dragging Ellen Rowe and Fawn with them. Wren saw Gavilan dive, watched the others scatter, and then the serpent struck and everything disappeared in an explosion of water. The raft flew apart, hammered into kindling. Wren went under, Fawn clinging desperately to her. She resurfaced, sputtering for air. Heads bobbed in the water, waves generated by the attack washing over them. The serpent's head reared in the haze once more, but this time Triss and Court had hold of it, swords stabbing and hacking furiously. Scales and dark blood flew, and the monster cried out in fury. Its body thrashed in an effort to shake loose its attackers, and then it dove. As it went under, Triss buried his sword into the scaly head and broke away. Court was still attacking, his youthful face grimly set. The serpent's body convulsed, scattering everyone. Stray logs from the shattered raft were sent spinning. One flew at Wren and caught her in a glancing blow along the side of her head. She had a momentary vision of the serpent diving, of Garth hauling Eowyn towards the shore, and of Ellen Rowe and the owl clinging to the other stray bits of the raft. And then everything went black. She drifted unfeeling, unfettered, numb to her soul. She could tell that she was sinking, but she didn't seem to be able to do anything about it. She held her breath as the water closed over her, then exhaled when she could hold it no longer and felt the water rush in. She cried out soundlessly, her voice lost to her. She could feel the weight of the old stones about her neck. She could feel them begin to burn. Then something caught hold of her and began to pull, something that fastened first on her tunic, then slipped down about her body. A hand first, then an arm. She was in the grip of another person. Slowly she began to ascend again. She surfaced, sputtering and choking, struggling to breathe as she coughed out the water in her lungs. Her rescuer was behind her, pulling her to safety. She lay back weakly and did not resist, still stunned from the blow and the near drowning. She blinked away the water in her eyes and looked back across the Rowan. It spread away in a choppy silver sheen, empty now of everything but debris. The serpent disappeared. She could hear voices calling, the Yowans, the owls, and one or two more. She heard her own name called. Fawn was no longer clinging to her. What had become of Fawn? Then the shore came into view on either side, and her rescuer ceased swimming and stood up, hauling her up as well and turning her about. She was face to face with Gavilan. "Are you all right, Wren?" he asked breathlessly, worn from the strain of hauling her. "Look at me." She did, and the anger she had felt toward him earlier faded. When she saw the look on his face, concern and a trace of fear were mirrored there, genuine and unforced. She gripped his hand. "It's okay. Everything's fine." She took a deep breath. Welcome breath of air. "Thank you, Gavilan." He looked surprisingly uncomfortable. "I said I was here to help you if you need it, but I didn't expect you to take me up on my offer so soon." He helped her from the water to where Ellenroe was waiting to fold her into her arms. She hugged Wren anxiously and whispered something barely audible, words that didn't need to be heard, to be understood. Garth was there as well, and the owl drenched and sorry looking, but unharmed. She saw most of their supplies stacked at the water's edge, soaked through but salvaged. Eowyn sat disabled and worn beneath a tree where Dar was looking after her. "Fawn," she called, and immediately heard a chittering. She looked out across the Rowan and saw the tree sweep clinging to a bit of wood several dozen yards away. She charged back out into the water until she was almost up to her neck, and then her furry companion abandoned its floats and swam quickly to reach her, scrambling up on her shoulder as she hauled it to shore. There, little one. You're safe as well now, aren't you?" A moment later, Triss stumbled ashore. One side of his sun-brown face scraped raw, his clothing torn and bloodied. He sat long enough for the owl to check him over, then rose to walk back down to the river with the others standing together. They looked out over the empty water. There was no sign of either Court or Stresser. "I didn't see the scat after the serpent struck the raft that last time," Gavilan said quietly, almost apologetically. "I'm sorry, Wren. I really am." She nodded without answering, unable to speak, the pain too great. She stood rigid and expressionless as she continued to search fugitively for the splinter scat. "Twice now I've left him," she was thinking. Triss reached down to tighten the stays on the sword he had picked up from the supplies they had salvaged. Court went down with the serpent. I don't think he was able to get free. Wren barely heard him, her thought dark and brooding. I should have looked for him when the raft sank. I should have tried to help. But she knew, even as she thought it, that there was nothing she could have done. "We have to go on," the owl said quietly. "We can't stay here." As if to emphasize his words, Kilishan rumbled in the distance, and the haze swirled sluggishly in response. They hesitated a moment longer, bunched close at the river bank, water dripping from their clothing, silent and unmoving. They slowly, one after another, they turned away. After picking up the backpacks and supplies and checking to be certain that their weapons were in place, they stalked off into the trees. Behind them, the rowan stretched away like a silver-grey shroud.